Hello guys, and welcome to my optimization guide for Assassin's Creed Origins. Assassin's Creed Origins came out in 2017, and even here in 2023, it's actually a pretty hard game to run, especially since resolutions are increasing, and now we are going up to 8K. Well, the standard is still pretty much 1080p, but we're slowly moving to 1440p, and now we're going up to 4K. And it's only going to keep increasing, and for that, some games that came out even 5 years ago can still be pretty tough to run. But honestly, even at 1080p, this game can be pretty tough to run because of its utilization of CPUs, which you're going to see later on in this guide. My goal with this guide is pretty much to show you guys the visual difference and the performance difference between each setting in the game that I think is relevant. And to do that, I have this tool on the screen right now that you guys should be able to see. So I'm going to do a quick rundown of what each thing in the tool means and what you should take away from it. The first thing we have is GPU, which is your graphics card in your PC. Usually it plays a big role in how games run. In this game, it doesn't play a huge role, but it plays quite a bit into the higher settings. But as you can see here, it's 95%. 100% is the max potential of each graphics card, no matter what graphics card it is. If you're below 100%, it means you're not maxing out the graphics card. Next up, we have the VRAM, which is the memory in the graphics card that determines like if you can load textures fast and all that stuff. It's part of the graphics card. Usually you want to keep this below the limit of your own graphics card. You should be able to see what your limit is based on your what graphics card you have. If not, you can always look it up or look at the box you bought. Next up, we have the CPU, which is your processor in your PC. It has the same thing as the GPU does, where 100% is its max potential. But typically a CPU doesn't run at 100% unless it is very CPU bottlenecked, which I'll talk about more later. Next up, we have the RAM, which shows the total system usage of RAM. Then we have the CPU cores right after. I have 16 in total on this CPU with hyper-threading, and it seems, based on what you can see here, you can see the usage of each core, because I bundled them together with the 1 and 2 and so on and so forth. So you can see each core beside each other. So it doesn't take up too much space, that's why they're beside each other. Below all the cores, you can see the 1% lows, or as they called it here, it's low 1%. It is typically all the lowest FPS bundled together, or 1% of the lowest FPS bundled together. And then it creates a sense of this is the lowest FPS you'll feel. So that's what you need to take away from that. This is the lowest FPS you'll feel when you game on Assassin's Creed Origins in this case. But it counts for any game. So again, just the lowest percentage, 1% you'll feel. So 1% of your experience might be that FPS. Then we have the minimum, which I probably should not include in this whole guide because the minimum is kind of irrelevant when it comes to having low percent ones or 1% lows in this case. We also have the average, which is very important usually, but because this game is a little bit special, the averages are a bit all over the place, so I have to rely on the normal FPS, which you can see with the D3D11, which is just DirectX 11 that is running. So that's how you know what version. Like otherwise, you see D3D12 or Vulkan, depending on what the game uses. And that's normal FPS right beside that. And below that, we have a graph, which shows frame time. Frame time determines the time between each frame. Well, it analyzes the time between each frame. And usually you want it to be as flat as possible to make sure you have an even time between each frame. A time when it spikes would be when you stutter in a game, as an example. Then you might see a big spike or a small spike, depending on how big the stutter is in time. Like how much time is from one frame to the next one. And the high below the frame time graph just means what setting I'm using, like whether it's low, high, very low, that kind of stuff. It's something I added myself just to make you guys more, so you know exactly what setting I'm showing to you. Now that that's out of the way, let's actually go to the first comparison, which is going to be the presets. I feel like that is the most important for people who just kind of want to see what the presets give you and then just move on and not watch the rest of the video. One thing you'll notice right away is that the CPU cores are all being utilized pretty well somehow in this DirectX 11 game. You can also see that the GPU fluctuates very heavily all the time, which means that it could be swapping between being CPU bottlenecked to being GPU bottlenecked. Another thing that is very noticeable would be the very low and low setting. Their 1% lows are significantly better than medium, high, very high, and ultra. So there could be something going on there that causes some issues. But all of them seem to be swapping between getting GPU limited and CPU limited, even on very low settings. You'll also notice that the quality of the ground goes very downhill right after high. Even very high is kind of on the limit for me, where everything below very high just looks very awful, especially very low. So I would definitely pick high here if I were to pick one of them. But if you want the smoothest experience, you could probably pick very low. But make sure to bump up the texture quality of the ground if at all possible. Even when it comes to FPS, it looks very weird. You can see that very low and low have very similar, medium and high have very similar, and very high and ultra high have very similar FPS. It's almost like they have the exact same settings, just a couple of them are lowered. But in general, I would say that from ultra high to very low, there's about a 30 to 40 FPS difference. So that's kind of tiny if you think about it in a game like this. Again, I think it's down to the whole CPU issue, where mostly it's textures you change, and you can't really make sure that you have less of a CPU bottleneck, so you're kind of forced to deal with the CPU bottleneck, which is why you most can gain like 40 from going to ultra high to very low. But it is still a 40 FPS difference, and I can still play a big part. And it's also important, now that this comparison is done, that I mention that when it comes to what FPS you want, it's important that you in your head say, okay, this is the FPS I want. Because my standard might not be your standard, and it's important that you follow what you want when it comes to these games. Next, we're moving over to Anti-Aliasing, and Anti-Aliasing removes jagged edges. It also needs to be said that for all of these tests, I'm going to use the ultra high preset as a base. And based on what we can see here, we can clearly see that from medium, low, and off, all of those settings kind of have the same performance, where high and dynamic stays in the same range. And that's because dynamic pretty much just means it is the same as high unless you go below 60 FPS. It pretty much just goes down with the anti-aliasing quality until you reach a certain FPS that you've set. Which I think the max is 60, so as long as I'm above 60, it's always going to be high. And again, high has the best visual quality, where medium you can see some jagged edges, and low and off kind of looks kind of bad. So I would probably stick to high, or if I really need performance, I'll go medium. And do note that using dynamic also increases the VRAM usage. So keep that in mind if you have trouble with VRAM. Now we have shadows. So when it comes to shadows, you need to ignore the 1% lows here, because I forgot to reset them. That's why they're all practically the same. But yeah, when it comes to shadows, from ultra high to high, you get about a 2 FPS difference. There's not really any difference that I've noticed between very high and ultra high. There's also not a difference that I noticed between very low, low, and medium when it comes to performance, okay? When it comes to performance. When it comes to the shadow quality, anything below high looks very awful in motion, as you can see. It looks all mushed together, and they don't really make up the detail to shadow very well. But the best balance here would probably be high, so I'd recommend high for those who want optimized settings. You'll also notice that going down to high gives you 100 less VRAM. Well, it gives you more VRAM technically, but it lowers the VRAM by 100, where going to very low lowers it by 200. So if you, or close to 200 anyway, maybe 150 or something. So if you want the best performance and you are having VRAM issues, going to very low can help you, but I would recommend high. Now we are at environment details. Here I barely notice a difference in image quality. There's also barely a difference in FPS. And if you really have to try to look for a difference in the FPS, the biggest difference seems to be going from ultra high to high, where it gives you about 2 FPS. Otherwise, I can barely notice any FPS difference. I can notice that at very low, it looks like the palm tree has lost a lot of detail, whereas low, medium, and high, I cannot really see a difference. Very high and ultra high, I can also barely see a difference there, so for this one, I would recommend high. If you have VRAM problems, I'll also recommend going to high, considering that you lose about 500 VRAM usage. So that's also a positive, so I recommend high for everyone here. We are now moving to texture detail, the one setting you usually want to crank up to max and has a very huge impact on the game. And wouldn't you know, it has barely any impact on the game. Again, probably because of the CPU limit we have. So, based on all of these things, I can see that going from high to medium probably gives you about maybe 1 to 2 more FPS, where I cannot see a difference from medium to low or very low. So the only difference is 1 to 2 FPS. If that is worth it to you to make the game look kinda meh, then go for it. But I would recommend high for anyone, because 1 to 2 FPS is simply not worth how the game looks. Especially since it has such a significant effect. Like, look at very low and low on the ground. Like, look at the ground. It is horrible. And it barely affects FPS at all. So again, I would recommend keeping this at high. If you have VRAM issues though, put this down to medium so you can save 500 megabytes of VRAM if that is something you want to do. Moving on over to Tessellation, we can see more of the same, where we get like 1 to 2 FPS for each step down we go in the settings. But here you can actually notice a little bit of a visual quality difference, where you can see very high the rocks have some form. Some of them still look a bit flat, but most of them seem to be more round. And the more left we go, the more over towards off we go, the less round they become, until off they become super flat. Based on my knowledge, everything involving geometry, the CPU has to calculate, and that could potentially help with the CPU bottleneck. But based on the FPS difference, it doesn't seem to change much still. So for that reason, I would still go with high for this one, just because it's barely any difference and it could potentially help with the CPU bottleneck. Again, since there's barely any difference, it wouldn't hurt your gameplay experience. So don't worry about that too much. Although if you want the best, you could go for very high. Getting to terrain, which is usually the stuff you climb, like rocks and mountains and stuff, you can actually see there's a huge difference. And that is most likely due to the geometry the CPU has to calculate. Therefore, by lowering the actual stuff the CPU has to do, you end up helping out your FPS by, it looks like it's from 5 to 8 FPS you gain from just lowering this to medium. And it's not even turning it off, it's just to medium. I also don't see a big visual difference in the actual quality. So for this setting, I'd recommend medium. You can also see that the 1% lows are significantly better. So putting this to medium will help you out a lot, especially if you have a CPU bottleneck. Moving on over to Clutter, which is really just foliage based on my own testing. We can see a very big visual difference from very low to very high, where the distance the foliage renders at becomes larger the higher up in settings you go, and the lower down you go, the distance seems to lessen, until at very low it kind of just disappears completely and you just have a flat ground, which makes it look a bit boring, so I would not recommend very low. You can also see that the FPS is practically the same, and very high seems to have better 1% lows and is more stable for some reason. My guess is that it is due to the very lovely CPU limit in the game. And for that reason, I would just recommend a very high for everyone, since there is no real difference in FPS, and it seems to be the most stable. Now looking at fog, we can see that there is a minor difference between high, medium, and very high. You can see that at medium, the fog is very thick. It doesn't have a lot of form to it, whereas high and very high has a bit of a form, where very high has more of a bottom layer, where high, the layer kind of dissipates, and in medium, it's just random fog all over the place. It's a minor visual difference. This setting also controls the accuracy of fog, not the actual quality of fog. So if you really feel like it, you can bump this to medium and you'll barely notice a difference, since in this game, fog doesn't play a huge part in the overall game. But you can also see that you can gain a little bit of FPS going from very high to high, which is a nice little boost of 4 to 6 FPS. Now at the end, you will see that I have a little bit of a weird issue with high, where my CPU bumps up heavily to 80%, and I don't know why that happened. It might be because I did something at the end of that one test. But if that happens to you at any point, just go ahead and use very high. Again, it could be because of the CPU limit that kind of just goes haywire whenever you lower very graphically heavy settings. So yeah, but here I would recommend high for those of you who want to optimize settings in this area, unless you just want medium to lower it as much as possible. Again, minimal change, but here I recommend high. Diving into the water, we can see that there is practically no FPS difference between any of the 4 quality levels. The only differences I could see and actually also notice is that between high and very high, you get 100 more VRAM. The other ones don't seem to give you much more, except low, which can give you about 50 more VRAM if you're really in a dire need of it. You can also see that the water becomes darker the more towards low you go. With high and medium, it's very slight, but you can still sort of notice it. And with low, it's very murky, very dirty water. You can also see, based on the ripples, that the ripples on low look very triangular, like they're not that accurate. Then on medium, they become more accurate, but still very inaccurate. And from high to very high, the ripples look better and look more accurate. Very high seems to also have the highest 1% lows, so I would definitely go with very high for this one. Unless you're having VRAM issues, then I would go to high. Jumping on over to screen space reflection, so we can see that there is about a 1 to 2 FPS difference when you go from high to medium. Same goes for when you jump to off from medium. So here I recommend medium. You can also see, based on the visual quality, that medium still retains a bit of the reflection, while off looks completely dead and boring. High looks the most alive and most interesting. But since we are optimizing, you still get some reflections with medium. Therefore, I recommend medium. But if you want the best visual quality and you don't care about the 1 to 2 FPS, then go with high. Flying on up to Volumetric Clouds, let's just see that with Volumetric Clouds off, we gain about 4 FPS, but the 1% averages actually decrease by about 20, which is very weird, but it does happen. Here I would recommend keeping Volumetric Clouds off, since it does give the actual normal FPS a boost. But if you notice the 1% lows again behaving weird, then turn it back on. But here I recommend Volumetric Clouds off, since you barely look up in the sky anywhere while playing the game. Going down to Character Texture Detail, we can see Bayek here, who's the main character, and what effect this setting has on his character when it comes to texture details. We can see right away that going from high to very low loses a lot of detail, and it doesn't actually benefit your FPS at all. If you look at all the different FPS levels between all of the different quality levels here, you can see that high is actually the best one. And again, I'm pretty sure that is due to the CPU limit the game has. But here, it's clear that I should pick high just because of the FPS actually worsening the lower down in quality I go. So this has a big effect on CPU usage, at least according to this test. Either that or there's something very wrong with this setting that causes all the different quality levels to somehow give you worse FPS. You can also see, looking at the VRAM, that you can save about 100 VRAM going from high to medium. But I recommend high for this one because it seems to be the most stable in this test, so I recommend high. Looking at character detail, I don't actually see a difference. Now, according to the setting, you're supposed to be able to see the difference in the clothes they're wearing. But based on my limited testing, the only difference I really saw was the amount of NPCs, which I don't even know if this setting changes. It could also just be the time of day in the game. I also didn't see a real FPS difference unless you go from ultra high to medium. That's like the only little, maybe 1 to 2 to 3 FPS difference I saw. But besides that, I didn't notice any difference in game at all besides the density of NPCs. It's also supposed to change the variety of NPCs. You see, like, they have different clothes and such, like I said before. But I did not notice that, therefore I don't think this is a setting that really changes much. I think it's better off to just change this to medium and then say that's enough. Because again, this was a very hard setting to test because I didn't find a lot of NPCs. So for this one, I recommend medium because I know for a fact that there's a little bit of a boost from going from ultra high to medium. But besides that, I didn't really see much of a difference. So I recommend medium. Now we're going to take a look at Ambient Occlusion. Ambient Occlusion adds shadowy details to objects to make them stand out more so they fit better into the game world, so nothing is always pretty static in like depth and darkness level and stuff like that. Which you can see in this comparison here, where very high it adds a lot of detail to the wood you see at the bottom, where off just makes the wood look boring and doesn't stand out too much. It has like one color throughout the whole wood, no darker colors associated with it, and that's what I mean by it adds a certain darkness to objects. If you look at the whole wall, you can also see that at off it lacks a lot of detail in the darker areas of the wall, where it has a lot of details in high and very, very high. The most detail you can see it very high, but high also doesn't look too bad and too far-fetched from very high. And if you look at the actual FPS you gain, going from very high to high can give you about 5 FPS. which is a lot, by the way. And going from high to off can also give you about 3 more FPS. So this is a setting that affects the game a lot for some reason. You can also see in VRAM that going from very high to high, you can save about 200 VRAM, surprisingly enough. It is a big jump for some reason. But I would actually go with high because you still retain a lot of the detail from very high. While it isn't as detailed as very high, you still gain a lot from it, so I would recommend high here. Moving along to depth of field allows us to see no difference at all. I don't know exactly how to activate depth of field in this game. They have a picture of a crocodile underwater to show depth of field, so I don't know if it's exclusive to underwater or not. But regardless of that, you can see that you actually gain about 3 to 4 FPS from just disabling it without actually being used. It does not work when you look at objects. The background does not get blurred out. In conversations at stores, the background doesn't get blurred out. I don't know if it activates in cutscenes. This is at the end of the game. I didn't really feel like starting a new game. But just showing you guys that you actually gain FPS even though it's not used and it's just enabled should tell you guys that you gain a bit more performance from just disabling it. So I highly recommend you disable depth of field since it pretty much does nothing and still takes performance. And it doesn't add much to the game, but if you prefer depth of field to be on where you can focus on an object closer to you in conversations or underwater if it actually works like that, then go ahead and keep it on. But I recommend turning it off. Those were the main graphic settings in the game, but there are a couple other settings that I feel are very relevant to getting better FPS. Starting with field of view, also known as FOV. Here we have 3 examples, FOV 85, 100 and 115. The standard is 100, by the way, that's default in the game. If you turn the FOV down to 85, you can then gain 2 to 3 FPS. If you increase it for some reason and you want more field of view, you can then lose around 2 FPS if you want that for some reason. So I recommend a field of view of 85. Next up, we have resolution, which is how many pixels make up your image. Here you can see that the standard is 1440p, by the way, but here you can see that going to 1080p can gain you about 20 FPS. A little bit more than 20 technically, but it kind of fluctuates. It's very hard to say. And going to 720p can actually only gain you about 7 more FPS because now we are hardcore CPU limited. This depends entirely on what CPU you have, how far down you can go. So keep in mind that this is the CPU limit for me, around 130 FPS. If you have a better CPU than mine, you can probably get higher. But resolution is very useful for people who cannot achieve the highest FPS and don't care about how the image looks to a certain extent. Like I would be fine with 1080p on a 1440p monitor if I really needed to see it. For those people who don't know, if you use a 1440p monitor with 1080p, the monitor becomes slightly blurry because it's designed for 1440p. And now you're kind of stretching out the pixels a little bit, which makes the quality look a little bit worse. But here I would recommend going with the native one you have. But if you really don't get the FPS you want specifically, then go ahead and lower to 1080p, but not any lower than 720p unless you have a very good CPU. There's also the resolution modifier, which modifies your current selected resolution. Instead of changing it to 720p or 1080p, you could use the resolution modifier to get the same performance as in 1080p, in percentage, by the way, if that's something you're interested in. It can be lowered all the way to 50%. It also helps with VRAM if you really need assistance with that. They have their own little thing on the screen that actually helps with VRAM as well. So if you're interested in getting the same resolution but still getting the performance of 1080p, then you can just go ahead and actually use the resolution modifier instead. If you have a very low graphics card usage, like 60, 50, 70% all the time, and it doesn't go up to 90 at all, that means you have a CPU bottleneck in the game. And to fix that, you would have to up all your settings to ultra. Yes, I know it seems counterintuitive, but it makes the GPU work more and makes the CPU work less. So what you need to do is you need to up all the settings to ultra. Then you need to go ahead and lower terrain to medium. Turn off volumetric clouds, turn off depth of field, and either turn off ambient occlusion or lower ambient occlusion. And I think that should help with the actual CPU bottleneck. And then see exactly how that performs in your game. It also helps to put an actual FPS limiter into the game, where you can limit your FPS. So let's say you have 100 FPS and you have a big CPU bottleneck and your CPU and your system starts lagging, then use an FPS limiter to make sure your CPU doesn't overwork itself so the rest of your system lags. It also stabilizes your frame rate, so you have a more stable 1% lows, and you also end up having a more stable frame rate and a stabler experience. I also tested full screen and windowed mode, and I did not see any difference besides windowed mode seeming a little bit more stable. That should be all the settings. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna compare ultra high, very low, my optimized settings, and the bottleneck settings to see which one best benefits you, or to see how much FPS we gained versus how much we had before, and so on and so forth. And here we have the final comparison. As you can see, we have very low optimized CPU bottle and ultra high. CPU bottle is the CPU bottleneck settings I suggested, which does not actually fix the CPU bottleneck. The only real way to fix the CPU bottleneck, which is what you take away from this, is by upgrading your CPU or by using a CPU limiter in case it affects your whole system when you have a CPU bottleneck. In this game, it should not affect your whole system because the CPU bottleneck does not mean using 100% of your cores in this case. It uses around 80 megs I've seen, and then it just doesn't use the rest. So you have at least 30 from each core to use on your system. Something else you might also notice is the VRAM usage. You can see that the very low one has the lowest VRAM usage, where optimized also has a decently low VRAM usage. Same goes for the CPU bottle, where it is better than ultra high, but it's not very much better. It's not that much better. And also, when it comes to FPS, we are getting 125 usually on the optimized one, where the CPU bottleneck one we go to 105 down to 100, and from ultra high we go from around 95 to about 100 as well. So we didn't gain a lot from the actual CPU bottleneck settings. Let's now take a look at the CPU bottleneck settings with the limiter on. The limiter probably also works the same on the ultra settings in case you want to do that instead of actually lowering the settings to have a stabler experience. And you can see that it is indeed the most stable experience. The FPS doesn't fluctuate at all. You can still see at the frame rate graph that there are a few small bumps here and there. But for the most part, it's very stable, except for the 1% lows, which are still worse than the optimized settings and the very low settings. Looking at the visuals, the one thing I noticed the most is definitely the water. The water looks the worst for me. And it's not exactly beautiful on the optimized settings, so you could probably higher it and you wouldn't hurt too much. I think it was, what was it, like 432 FPS you could gain from it. So you'll just lose 2 FPS if you really want better looking water to get rid of that ugly mess you see out there that has no reflections. But yeah, that's pretty much all the differences I really notice. Besides the water, I think I've succeeded in creating an experience with optimized settings that is almost as good as ultra high settings. And I gained 25 FPS out of the 40 you can gain from going to very low, so I'm very happy with the result. And I hope you learned some new stuff about some settings or about some programs that can help you out, or about FPS limiters, stuff like that can make your gameplay experience better. I also hope you learned how to improve your FPS universally, not just in this game. I will of course try to make more of these guys for different games in the future. This one took me a long time, maybe like 12 hours in total, maybe 14 hours in total. I'm very new to this, so I hope I did it all right. But I hope you guys enjoyed watching. If you did, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing. Hope to see you in another one of my Let's Plays or optimization guides. I do those too. And hopefully see you there. Stay awesome.